The sky above the fjord had turned to iron. Clouds lay heavy and bruised, pressing down until the air itself felt close enough to touch. The tide surged beneath the cliff, striking stone with the rhythm of a giant's heartbeat. Every beat carried the same question: who will still breathe when the next dawn arrives? Inside the longhouse, firelight trembled across faces worn by sea wind and winter. Shadows gathered in the rafters like watchful spirits, each crack in the timber seeming to breathe with the hush of the night. No one spoke at first. Only the pop of resin in the flames and the low groan of the storm outside kept company. Then an old voice broke the silence. It belonged to a Scot, the gray-haired skald whose stories had carried children into sleep and warriors into courage. He lifted a carved staff, its surface crawling with runes burned deep over a lifetime, and tapped it 3 times on the floor. Once for the ancestors, once for the unborn, once for the living who stand between. The room answered in stillness. Even children, curled against their mothers' cloaks, opened their eyes wide. "You know what waits across the water," a Scot said. His voice carried the gravel of years, but none of the weakness. "Men who hunger for our land, men who believe the gods have written our end. But no god writes alone. Tonight you will speak back. You will tell them who we are." A murmur passed through the crowd, not words yet, but a sound like the wind before it becomes a gale. At the front, a woman stepped forward. She wore no crown, no mark of office, yet the longhouse tilted toward her as if pulled by gravity. Her name was Solveig, Shield Maiden, widow of the last battle, mother to a boy too young to carry steel. Her hair was bound with red thread, her eyes the color of glacier water. She held her son's small hand as if it were both anchor and weapon. "My husband lies beneath the cairn," she said, her tone steady as a drawn blade. "Tomorrow I stand in his place. And if I fall, my boy will remember me not as a weeper, but as one who stood." Her words set the air trembling. The boy looked at her not with fear, but with something brighter, a new awareness that the stories around him had shifted, and he was inside one now. From the other side of the fire came Bjorn, the smith. His arms were black with soot, veins raised like rivets beneath skin. He carried a hammer still warm from the forge. "Every blade you hold tomorrow I tempered tonight. Every edge carries part of my breath. Do not think you go alone." He placed the hammer on the hearthstone as if laying down a vow. The murmurs deepened, becoming rhythm. A drumbeat of human sound. Scott raised his staff again. "Let us begin." Voices lifted. Not a polished hymn, but a rough weaving of sound, each person lending what they had, some a clear note, others a rasp, a whisper, a child's thin cry. Together it grew until the longhouse itself seemed to sway with the weight of it. The song named the sea, the mountains, the blood in their veins. It called on gods both old and new, Odin beside the white Christ, Freya beside Mary, as if no boundary could silence them when death pressed so near. The flames rose with the voices. Faces glowed like molten ore, every wrinkle and scar etched sharp as if by the hand of a carver. Between the words, silence pulsed, moments where hearts seemed to stop, then crash forward again. Solveig's son pressed closer to her side. She bent down, whispered something that only he could hear, and his small shoulders straightened. For him, the hymn was no abstraction. It was the moment his world became both heavier and brighter. At the far end of the hall, an elder woman lifted a drinking horn high. She poured mead onto the floorboards, a libation to the unseen. The liquid hissed where it struck the fire. Sparks leapt, and for an instant, it seemed the ancestors stood there, watching through the smoke, nodding approval. The hymn reached its height. Words dissolved into raw sound, half cry, half battle cry. It was not beautiful, it was necessary. And in that necessity, it became more than music. It became a weapon forged of voices. Outside, the storm broke at last. Thunder rolled over the mountains like the beating of war drums. The sea answered with a roar. Yet inside the longhouse, the people did not flinch. They sang louder, as if daring the storm to remember their names. And in that moment, before sword was drawn, before blood touched the ground, the village was already a battlefield, one claimed first by song, by vow, by the fierce refusal to be forgotten. The hymn dwindled into silence, but silence did not mean stillness. Breath still rattled in chests, eyes shone with the residue of fire and chant. The longhouse no longer felt like shelter, but like a crucible, burning fear down into something harder. Solveig sat with her son beside the fire. He had not spoken since the song began, but his small hand clutched her wrist with surprising strength. She knew he had memorized every gesture, every vow. Tomorrow, when he grew old enough to wield steel, these images would be his inheritance, the look of his mother's face as she pledged her life without trembling. She kissed his hair once, then released him to the care of the elder women. A boy should not hear all that must be said next. Escott, the skald, raised his staff once more. We are not done. Words spoken in song bind the heart. Words spoken in oath bind the hand. Tonight, neither can be spared. From the shadows stepped Eric the Younger, broad-shouldered, but scarcely more than 20 winters. His father had fallen to raiders the year before. His body never returned. Eric's jaw worked as if grinding stone as he stood before the hearth. I swear by the salt of the sea and the iron in my blood, he said, voice trembling but unbroken, that I will not falter until the enemy lies broken or I lie beside my father in the dark. He drew a knife and cut his palm. The blood hissed as he pressed it to the firestone. A murmur of approval rolled through the hall. Not all were eager for the oath. Fear shifted in the corners of the room like restless smoke. But no one would shame a youth who gave his blood to the fire. Next came Ingrid, an elder with a bent back and eyes still sharp as falcons. Once she had fought on deck beside men, her axe's story whispered among survivors. She walked slowly, leaning on her cane, but when she reached the fire her spine seemed to straighten with memory. I no longer lift steel, she said, but I can still lift names. She spoke them dozens, maybe 100 warriors who had stood with her in younger days, each syllable carved into the room like a rune. Their voices walk with us tomorrow. Do not forget them when the line shakes. Bjorn the smith added coal to the flames until sparks leapt high as stars. This fire will not die before dawn, he said. So long as it burns, every weapon you carry remembers the forge. His soot-darkened face glowed with conviction. Yet not all voices matched the fervor. Near the back, a farmer named Torvald shifted uneasily. He had never sought glory. His fields were his pride, his oxen his legacy. When a Scots's eyes landed on him, Torvald stood reluctantly. I will fight, he admitted, but I do not sing of crowns or feasts. I sing of soil. I fight so my sons may sow it. I ask only that if I fall, my fields do not lie empty. The room quieted. No cheer followed, no roar of approval, only solemn nods. His truth was heavier than bravado, and perhaps more sacred. Solveig felt it land in her chest like a stone. As the oaths wove together, the longhouse filled with smoke from the overfed fire. The beams groaned as wind pressed against the roof, reminding all that dawn crept closer with every gust. Some reached for cups of mead, others clasped forearms, trading grip for grip as if building a chain across the room. Then Scott gave the final instruction. Each of you will sleep with your weapon at your side tonight. Steel must feel the warmth of its bearer before it tastes blood. Dream with it near you. Let it learn your breath, your heartbeat. Tomorrow it will not fail you. One by one, they laid blades, hammers, and bows across their knees. Solveig rested her hand on her shield's rim, feeling the rough grooves carved by her husband's grip. Torvald stroked the haft of his farming spear, a tool turned into a desperate weapon. Eric kissed the hilt of his father's sword, its edge dull but its history sharper than any new forged steel. Outside, the storm thickened. Thunder cracked, and the earth trembled in reply. The night no longer belonged to men alone. It belonged to gods, to ghosts, to the future pressing against the present like a blade against a whetstone. Solveig closed her eyes. She saw her husband's cairn, the stones dark with rain, and imagined him watching from beyond. She whispered into the storm, not a prayer, not a plea, but a promise. I will not let his death be the end of us. And as the longhouse settled into uneasy rest, the weight of countless oaths hung in the smoky air, heavier than any weapon. Dawn would demand payment soon, The storm broke before sunrise. When the first pale streak of light bled over the fjord, the clouds had thinned into ragged veils. Rain dripped from the roof of the longhouse, each drop a tick in the world's great clock. The warriors stirred, their weapons lying beside them like silent companions, their dreams filled with salt, fire, and the weight of tomorrow. Solveig was already awake. She had not slept, only drifted in and out of memory, her husband's laugh, the last time she had held his hand, the moment his body was carried past her. Her shield lay across her knees, her son curled against her side. She kissed his forehead, then pried her arm free gently. The boy did not stir. Better that way, she thought. Let him sleep until I am gone. The door shuddered open. A figure stumbled in, drenched, half-frozen, his cloak torn by bramble and wind. The room stiffened. Weapons shifted instantly into hands. It was a boy, not older than 16, barefoot and bleeding at the ankles. His eyes were wide with the glassy stare of someone who had outrun his soul. He collapsed just inside the threshold. Bjorn and Eric rushed to catch him. "Speak," a Scot commanded, his voice low but sharp. The boy gasped, his chest heaving like a bellows. They are not waiting across the sea," he stammered. "They are here." The words cracked the silence like lightning. "What do you mean here?" Solveig demanded, stepping forward. The boy's head jerked toward the door, eyes swimming with terror. "They landed in the night. Ships, more than we counted. They burned the outpost at Skelder Bay." My father, his throat closed. He pressed fists against his eyes. I ran to warn you. They march even now." The longhouse erupted, voices colliding, fear and fury spilling into the air. Torvald's face went pale. Ingrid struck her cane against the floor until the noise shrank back into silence. Escott's staff trembled in his grip. "So the storm was not sent to hide us," he said, voice hollow. "It was sent to hide them." A wave of realization washed over the hall. They had believed dawn would give them hours to march, to meet the enemy on the shoreline where they could brace their lines. Now the war was at their door before they had even stepped outside. Eric slammed his fist against the hearthstone. "Then we fight here. Let them choke on our smoke." But Solveig's mind raced faster than her blood. She saw the boy's trembling body, the smoke in his hair from the burned outpost, the truth in his eyes. If the enemy already walked the forest trails, their village would be ashes before the sun cleared the horizon. She turned to the women, the children, the farmers, those who had not sworn for blood but for soil. She thought of her son. "No," she said, her voice cutting through the storm of voices. "We cannot hold them here. If we stand in the longhouse, it becomes our grave. We must move, now." Gasps circled the fire. "Abandon the village," someone cried. Solveig shook her head fiercely. "Not abandon. Outwit. We know these forests, these ridges, the river that floods in spring. We can strike where they do not expect. We can buy time for the children to be carried to safety." For a heartbeat, no one spoke. The oath they had made was to fight at dawn, to stand shoulder to shoulder. But oaths made in ignorance must sometimes be broken to serve truth. The tension was a blade drawn between them. It was Torvald who broke it. "She is right," he said, his farmer's voice heavy but sure. "If I fall, let it be in the field I plow, not in a hall-turned coffin. We cannot give them what they want." Eric bristled, torn between pride and reason. His hand clutched the sword that had belonged to his father. Then his eyes fell on the boy, his bare feet raw, his face streaked with ash. Slowly, Eric lowered the blade. The decision settled over them like a second storm. Plans shifted in hurried whispers, which path to take, who would carry the children, who would stay behind to set fires as decoys. Every face was shadowed by fear, but beneath it flickered something sharper, defiance. Solveig tightened her grip on her shield. This was not the battle they had prepared for. It was harder, crueler, more uncertain. Yet in its cruelty lay a kind of freedom. No destiny was written in stone. They would carve it themselves, even if the carving cost blood. Outside, the first horns of the enemy sounded across the valley. Low, mournful, and endless. The sound of a tide already breaking. The people of the longhouse rose together, not in ceremony now, but in grim, urgent motion. They had sung their hymn. Now they would decide if the hymn was prophecy or weapon. The village was no longer a place of rest. Within moments of the boys' warning, the longhouse that had been a hearth became a war camp. Fires were banked low, torches doused, weapons strapped across shoulders. The smell of smoke lingered in the beams, but now it was not the safe smoke of a hearth. It was the acrid ghost of the outpost already lost. Solveig stood at the doorway, her shield slung across her back, her son pressed against her hip. He clung to her tunic, silent, eyes wide enough to swallow the firelight. She bent and pressed his face to her chest. "You must go with the others," she whispered, though her voice faltered. "Follow the river trail. Stay quiet. Do not look back. I don't want to leave you," he said. His voice cracked, and it split her heart sharper than any blade. She cupped his face in her hands. "If I fall, you will carry my name. That is a greater battle than any I can fight." She kissed his brow, then placed him into Ingrid's arms. The old warrior, bent but unbroken, met her gaze with a nod. No words were needed. The trust between them was iron. Behind them, Torvald tied bundles of food into packs, his hands trembling not from fear but from haste. "The little ones must reach the ridge before the horns sound again," he muttered. "If they see smoke, it must be from the traps we leave, not from our homes burning." Bjorn hefted an axe, the handle black with soot. "I will stay to set the fires," he said. "The forge taught me how to burn and how to build. Tonight it must burn." His eyes found Solveig's, and for a moment he was not the smith, but the brother she had never had. "If I fall, tell my wife I died as steel, not ash." The group divided. Half to flee with the children and the old, half to linger and strike where they could. The decision cut through them like a wound, but it was clean, no hesitation remained once chosen. Eric hovered near Solveig, jaw clenched, eyes darting to the sword at his hip. "I should go with the children," he said suddenly. The words startled even him. "I am not ready." Solveig turned to him, her face both fierce and tender. "No one is ready. Readiness is a lie we tell ourselves so fear will stay quiet. But fear will not stay quiet, Eric. You cannot silence it. You can only walk with it. Will you?" The young man's throat worked. He nodded, not bravely, but honestly. That honesty steadied her more than false courage ever could. From the doorway came the distant thud of drums. Not their own. The enemy's. Slow, deliberate, the beat of inevitability. The boy had not lied, they were close, perhaps already in the treeline. The villagers stiffened at the sound, some clutching charms, others whispering prayers in whatever language they trusted most. Odin's name mixed with Christ's in the same breath, and no one corrected anyone else. Solveig felt the weight of the shield on her back. Her husband's grip marks still notched its rim. She traced them with her fingers, feeling his ghost beneath her skin. She thought of her son now carried toward the ridge, his small frame lost in the swirl of cloaks and hurrying feet. Her heart screamed to run after him, to hold him one more moment. But her body stayed rooted. If she ran, the enemy would overtake them all. If she stood, he might live. Torvald joined her at the threshold. His farming spear looked almost pitiful beside her shield, yet his face was carved with quiet resolve. "So," he said, his voice low, "this is where the soil asks us to water it." She almost smiled. "With luck, we'll water it with theirs first." They shared a brief laugh, the kind born not from humor but from defiance. It cut through the tension like sunlight through cloud, if only for a heartbeat. Escott raised his staff. "Listen," he said, his voice trembling with age and conviction. "The hymn does not end because we left the longhouse. Every step we take now is another verse. Every breath you draw is a line. Do not let them silence our song." The warriors tightened their grips. The mothers vanished into the forest with the children. The old skald stood at the center, staff raised like a banner. Then the horns sounded again, closer, hungrier. The ground quivered beneath the tread of many boots. Solveig inhaled deeply, the cold air burning her lungs. She did not know if the gods were watching, if the hymn would carry their names into eternity. But she knew one thing with bone-deep certainty. The choice had already been made. They would not beg to be spared. She turned to her companions, her voice fierce, clear, and steady. "We fight not for glory, not for crowns. We fight because behind us walks the future, and it must not die here." The drums grew louder. The horns screamed. The tree leaves swayed with shadows. And as the first enemy figures emerged from the mist, the villagers braced themselves. Between fear and steel, between love and loss, the stage for the final storm was set. The mist tore open with the sound of war. The first enemy's spear cracked against a shield, the impact ringing like a church bell struck wrong. Solveig staggered back, bracing, her breath ripped from her lungs. Then the world collapsed into noise, iron on wood, cries cut short, the storm of men colliding. She roared, more to steady herself than to frighten. Her shield thrust forward, catching a blade and shoving it aside. She pivoted, swung her axe low, and felt it strike, not the fantasy of a feast-hall enemy, but a body, warm, human, breaking beneath her. The shock jolted through her arms. For a heartbeat, she wanted to drop everything and run. But then Torvald was at her side, his farmer's spear trembling as it sank into another man's chest, and there was no time to think. The village became a labyrinth of violence. Smoke curled from the decoy fires Bjorn had set, swallowing figures into shadows. The smith himself swung his axe like a man breaking down doors, each blow a vow kept. Eric fought near him, face pale, lips moving silently, prayer or curse, no one knew. Each time his blade struck, his youth fell away, layer by layer, until only the raw, desperate core of a man remained. The horns of the enemy blared again, but the villagers answered with their own sound. The hymn, ragged and torn, shouted in gasps between strikes. It was no longer melody, only fragments, sky, light, honor, but together it was enough. The song stitched them together, breath by bloody breath. Solveig's arm grew heavy. Her shield rim split, her axe nicked and dulled. An enemy surged toward her, a giant of a man, helm crowned with antlers. His sword rose, wide and merciless. She lifted her shield too late. The blade fell, but Torvald stepped between them. His farming spear caught the strike, snapping clean in two, yet slowing the sword enough. The farmer's body folded beneath the blow. He fell without a sound. Time cracked open. Solveig saw his fields in that instant, the rows of soil, the oxen trudging, the children running with bare feet. Then she saw only his stillness. Something inside her snapped. With a scream torn from the marrow, she drove her axe into the giant's throat. Both fell, the antlered man choking on his own blood, Torvald staring at the sky as though it might forgive him. Her knees threatened to buckle. She wanted to cradle him, to weep. But the press of enemies forced her on. She whispered instead, "Your fields will not lie empty," and rose again. The battle surged toward the longhouse. Flames licked higher, consuming beams and banners alike. Bjorn disappeared into the smoke, his war cry turning suddenly into a cough, then silence. Solveig spun, but saw nothing, only a flash of his axe vanishing in the fire's roar. Eric stumbled beside her, his sword slick. His eyes were wide, wild. "We can't hold them," he cried, voice breaking. "There are too many." "Then we don't hold them," she shouted back. "We bleed them." Together they drove into the fray, carving a path not to victory but to delay. Each second mattered. Each enemy slowed meant another step for the children climbing the ridge. At the edge of the chaos, a Scot still stood. The skald's staff was raised, though his body shook. He shouted words no longer entirely his own, half hymn, half command, his voice weaving through the smoke like a thread binding the torn world together. Some swore they saw figures in the haze behind him, shadows of ancestors, faces carved in flame and mist. Then came the moment that would be remembered. The enemy captain pushed forward, armored and towering, his cloak snapping like a banner. He strode toward the skald. Solveig saw it too late. The captain's blade arced, swift and merciless, and a Scot crumpled as though the song itself had been cut. The hymn faltered. For a heartbeat, silence devoured everything. Solveig felt the weight of despair crush her chest. Without the old man's voice, the night seemed lost. Then Eric raised his sword, his young, raw voice tearing through the void. Sing. And they did. Hoarse, broken, every throat-bleeding sound. Even as the enemy surged, even as fire consumed the longhouse, they sang. Solveig raised her shield once more. Her body screamed for rest, her soul for release. But she had no right to either. Not yet. The hymn surged in her chest, fiercer than fear, louder than grief. She did not know if this was the end or the threshold. But as she met the enemy's eyes, blood in her mouth and fire at her back, she understood the hymn was never meant to save them. It was meant to mark them so the world could not forget they had stood here. And she stood by the time the sun crested the ridge. The village was ash. Smoke drifted upward in ragged banners, carrying with it the smell of pine, salt, and blood. Where the longhouse had stood, a beacon of warmth, of laughter, of oaths, only blackened timbers leaned like broken ribs. The hymn had ended in cries, yet the echoes lingered, stitched into the ruin. On the high path above the fjord, the survivors looked back. The women who had carried children on their hips, the elders with their bent backs, the frightened boys and girls who clutched each other's hands, they stood in silence, their faces lit by the cruel light of morning. Every plume of smoke was a name, every collapsed wall a story that had been written in fire. Solveig stumbled into their midst. Her shield was gone, her axe lost, her body striped with cuts and soot. She moved as if pulled by invisible ropes, every step an argument against collapse. Her eyes scanned the group until she found him, her son, his cheeks streaked with dirt and tears. When he saw her, he ran. She dropped to her knees and caught him, arms tightening as though she could bind the world together by holding him. For a long time she said nothing, only pressed her face into his hair. Eric came last, limping, his father's sword bent and blackened. His face was pale, but in his eyes burned something new, not the wild terror of the boy who had trembled by the fire, but a quiet, raw determination. When he lowered himself to the ground, the children gathered around him. One by one, they touched the ruined sword, as though recognizing in it their own survival. The losses were named in murmurs. Torvald, the farmer, gone beneath his broken spear. Bjorn, the smith, swallowed by the fire. Ingrid, who had led the children halfway up the ridge before her heart gave out. And Ascot, the skald, whose staff still smoldered in the ashes. Each name fell into the air like a stone into deep water. None made a ripple, but all weighed the same. Solveig rose to her feet. Her son clung to her side, but she lifted her gaze to the smoke twisting skyward. She thought of Torvald's promise to his fields, Bjorn's vow to his wife, Ingrid's long list of names. The hymn had not saved them. But perhaps that had never been its purpose. She spoke, not loudly, but with a steadiness that made every face turn. We are not finished. So long as we breathe, the hymn continues. It is no longer the hymn of crowns or golden halls. It is the hymn of bread, of soil, of children who must outlive us. If we forget, then their deaths are wasted. If we remember, they are eternal. The people nodded, some with tears, some with clenched jaws. The children listened wide-eyed, as though the words themselves were fire to warm their thin shoulders. Eric pressed a hand to the broken sword, and Solveig laid her palm atop his. Others followed, women, elders, even the youngest child. Soon every hand touched steel, ash, or each other. A new chain was forged, not of iron but of promise. When the smoke thinned, they began to move. Down the ridge, away from the ruin, into the forest that would swallow them until they could find another place to settle. The fjord lay behind them, scarred and blackened, but the mountains ahead caught the sunlight. The path was uncertain, yet the rhythm of footsteps felt like the start of another hymn. Solveig walked at the front, her son's hand in hers. Each step hurt, but each step mattered. She did not know if tomorrow would bring peace or another enemy. But she knew this. They had not been erased. The world would carry their song in whispers, in scars, in the memory of smoke curling into the dawn. At the ridge's crest, she paused. The wind tore through her hair, carrying with it the faintest trace of voices, the roar of Bjorn's laughter, Torvald's quiet vow, Ascot's unbroken chant. For a moment she closed her eyes and let the sound fill her chest. Then she turned away. The survivors moved on, their backs to the ruin, their faces to the horizon. Behind them, the smoke rose like a hymn the sky itself had taken up. And though the longhouse was gone, the song was not.